Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Robert Hanserd, and he currently is Associate Professor of History at Columbia College. Dr. Hanserd's research primarily is West African Gold Coast cosmologies, cultures, and histories. He looks at the Afro-Atlantic inspirations for Maroons, free black colonies, and slave resistance in the U.S. and also across the Americas. His publications recently have been African Indigenous Systems, and the one we want to talk about today, which is 500 Voices, a catalog of published narratives by Africans enslaved in the Transatlantic Slave Trade. It's an amazing undertaking to assemble these voices. I thought we could start with just, maybe you can describe the collection a little bit. Are these documents? Are these recorded oral histories? How did you go about assembling the material?
Our main criteria, and thank you for having me, was to find published accounts, right? And it could have been contemporary to the period or even maybe more recent, identification of published accounts. But that was where we sort of could specify. Because if you brought in oral accounts, if you start to bring in stuff that you might find in the archives, it could get too big.
Yeah.
Too big. There's so much. And then another criteria I think that helped us sort of narrow it down was to say these are folks that we wanted to definitely be able to identify as originating in Africa and then finding their way into the Americas. And so when we sort of nailed those down, we were able to identify, a number of sources. And, my colleague, Aaron Fogelman, who also, is co-author for this, really at the outset, under the presumption that many historians have that there's only a few of these accounts begin to look, and then they just started to show up.
Yeah, that's the general conception. We're lucky we found one document, like the priest that wrote about the Native Americans and the Spaniards' abuse of them. It's like, well, that's the only one that we can find. So the general conception is there's not much there, but you were able to uncover. So what was that process like? Where would you start? Did you actually go to Ghana and the Ivory Coast and
Good question. I think there's some of both going on. I think there was a need to translate from different European languages. Like the Oldendorp accounts, which are very unique. I may come back to those, are in German, and so German, and so Aaron could focus on those, they're just it was looking in different places and just eventually coming across these very interesting stories and just sort of once you could sort of draw them to Africa, for me that was the most important sort of feature of that.
Make the connection that they're actually from Africa and somebody had recorded their testimony or their story or described it in some
right. And sometimes, there can be problems with the translation. So you got to be careful about how maybe the author or even the publisher might sort of interpret or extrapolate meaning from this African stuff. But even with that being said, most of these folks can identify and specify their origin and talk about their experiences in Africa. And that, I think, was such a unique component that we wanted to, share.
Was there a danger of the people that are recording this? If they're like colonialists, like if they're British in Ghana and they're recording things, they don't seem to have a particular concern about truth or accuracy. Was there a concern when you found the documents that there may be some filter that got in the way? So how can you, can you verify that this is a story that's has some veracity to it anyway?
I think they're all, many of them have that filter. Being sort of translated from maybe this sort of Europeanist perspective. Sometimes they see African ideas of civilization, of culture, and history in very problematic ways. But we still have to use those accounts, I think. Maybe I sort of reference Oldendorp, but like maybe take another person, Zorna Hurston too, whose account was sort of questionable. On the way on the other end, looking at Cujo or this guy, Kosoko, who actually is from the Benin region, right? The process that she undergoes to extrapolate meaning and history and culture from this text, there's still some mediation with her version, right? So I think you have to be careful with everything you read. I think as a rule with history, you got to be sort of careful. But are these African accounts often, sort of extra distortive? Yeah. But relying on my own research and sort of study of African culture, and as well as reaching out to other experts, we were able to sort of nail down and sort of filter through maybe something that might have been a phonetic reference to a particular place or a space and say, okay, this is what they mean. And oftentimes that's part of how you're working, these stories of African history and culture. I mean, you always hear people talk about the sort of potsherds of history, and I would agree. It's that kind of thing because you're picking up pieces and sort of pulling things together. So these, and for me, what these accounts do is they just help you nail it down in these sort of published examples, written examples of these people's lives.
If there's a narrative or if there's themes that come through, even if they have some European distortion, if there's certain themes that come through, you can almost extrapolate the elements that the kind of the nuggets of truth that are within there. So, and you didn't feel compelled to like leave one out and put one in because this one's questionable. I mean, that's not.
Oh, I mean, there were some that we had to let go because they may have been repeats of maybe some of these original versions. Where another newspaper maybe here in North America or something will pick up that story and rewrite it. I mean, you got to really be careful, but they're there. They provide us with this sort of piece of African history and culture. That to me is like so important. I mean, linking people to civilizations and cultures and ideas, belief systems, spirituality, craft, practice, range of things, all these elements of peoples and identities and of histories that you can find when you start to look at some of these sources.
And I understand that a whole part of the motivation for this is to have the voices of people that were in Africa before they get enslaved, before they get captured and put in bondage, and because the voices that may relate that experience once they're here in the U.S. or Haiti or Brazil would not necessarily be accurate portrayals, or it's only one part of that narrative?
I think it's around just this idea of, finding people that meet this criteria, that have a published version that describes their experiences in Africa, and then can talk about their transition to the Americas. And you're right. You have the distortion and even the what happens in the context of the Americas will transform the way maybe people might consider telling these narratives. You have African spiritualists in some instances who become Christianized or Moravian or Protestant or Catholic or other things. So and that may filter into how they'll recount that story. So but you sort of have to sort of take that in. But it's interesting to say, hey, here's someone who was a priest on the African side, and maybe they make some slight mention of their where they're from. So they say Amina, and they say they were a priest on the African side. Now all of a sudden you have someone, you can nail them down to the Gold Coast, you can nail them down to their practice on the Gold Coast, and you can get into chronology. So like if you're in the right 18th century sort of time frame, and like Odenthorpe, I reference him a lot because he's interviewing these folks in the Gold Coast who I was quite interested
at that time, right?
Just 3 decades prior to a major event in the Gold Coast. That is the reason why a lot of these captives will end up there. Right, and so what Oldendorp is recording, and you're right. Once again, you have problems maybe with the way things are being sort of recounted, but in the backdrop is this knowledge of a rebellion in 1730 in a Gold Coast region called Aqua Pim, where they will really fight to establish themselves as sort of autonomous peoples. With some tension and frustration with the local groups, but in the war that will bring about their sort of freedom or their nation, many of those folks will be ejected over here to Danish, St. Andrews, St. Thomas, and other places, and they act in ways that are very interesting and connective to what they're doing in the Americas based on their status and other kinds of things.
I think we might take a moment here to kind of step off to the side a minute. I know about Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, and Man Eltis, The Rise of African Slavery in the Americas, and we have a general knowledge that some 12 million people were transported from one side of the Atlantic to the other side, and not to speak of the millions that didn't make it because they resisted on the way.
Correct.
So I guess maybe you take a minute to describe what that period was like. I understand it. You can't necessarily narrow it down to a specific date, but 18th, 19th century was the bulk of the movement. So what did that, we even have a word for it. It's called Middle Passage. What does, for our viewers, what how would we kind of encapsulate what that African slave trade, that transatlantic journey, looked like?
Yeah, I mean, I think rightfully Eric Williams, Eltis, others, even like some other writers who are thinking about slavery, even Blassingame, and others, kind of come to mind. It is this horrendous and horrific experience. I mean, there's no getting around the nature of that. It's a very violent. Millions of people will be disrupted or lose their lives in the context of this 4 century sort of era of violence. I mean, and yeah, you talk about sometimes someone getting on a ship and maybe somewhere in Africa, depending on where they enter or embark, and then ending up not getting out for 6, maybe 9 months if they're going to make the whole journey. Maybe they stop off in South America, maybe they come to the Caribbean, and in North America may be their last stop, and then they're going to drop that off. So then, I mean, that person's made a serious sort of trek under the hollows of this sort of very small space to live in, sort of breathe in, always chained together quite frequently. I mean, a lot of those sort of ideations that are pushed forward by, there's a very famous image, Brooks' ship of abolitionists, that was used to sort of make the case for abolition, and it shows all of these Africans in there. They literally look like little matchsticks sort of lined up. But if you can imagine that idea of being held in that duress for anywhere from 3 to 9 months, I mean, you begin to get at it. But I would add one other thing, though. I mean, in addition to maybe historical and historiography that talks about slavery and identifies it in the context of these horrors, and we do not want to downplay those. But you also have something very unique, and sort of the reference. I mean, if you know Henry Louis Gates and some of his stuff, I'm going to pull back on some old stuff. The Signifying Monkey, one of his earlier, writings, where he's talking about how captives are bringing elements of their own identity from Africa and how they're finding it and how it has to be found at the water. And it's just this amazing sort of narrative. It gets into certainly some of the oral traditions. He uses a poem to talk about Africans ending up in eastern Cuba, El Santiago, and so there's all this spirituality connected with it. But the idea is that these Africans have to go to the water to connect to their culture.
And I understood there was attempts by the slaveholders to often separate people from the same regions. So you wouldn't want, because then you can speak the same language, you can hang on to your own culture, but if you separate people so that they're completely displaced. At the same time, and maybe we can talk about this in a minute, at the same time there's a resistance to this, because you have to assume the people that didn't make it over were probably some of the worst that would refuse to be bullied and refuse to be shackled in the rest. And we also have the example of Amistad, where there's successful revolts, or even the Haitian Revolution, which it doesn't detract from the horror or the enslavement, but it does suggest that this is not just a subdued population that are easy to manipulate, and they have to be forced to work. I mean, all kinds of racist tropes that go along with that. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like Haiti is influenced in large part by fine ideas of voodoo. So there's that spiritual connection as well as a cosmological link that inspires that rebellion. But even prior to that, because I like to just come back to one thing you mentioned about how potentially captives would try to separate people from different ethnic groups. They tried. Let's say that, because they weren't very successful. And an example of that is a rebellion that's 2 generations prior to the Haitian that occur in Jamaica, Tacky's Rebellion, the Maroon Rebellions, and all of these guys are affixing themselves or affiliating themselves to an identity, be it one that's constructed in the Atlantic and has some connections to Africa. Maybe you could tease some of those out, but here they are, connecting to an identity. Not all of them are from the Gold Coast, but it's a Gold Coast identity, and people are organizing around it to resist a Comirati, and they will fight in a way that says, hey, you brought people together, you tried to separate folks out, and people, they found each other. On Jamaica, they found each other, and,
and they wouldn't necessarily have to be from the same cultural background.
Not necessarily.
But there's certain identity that's against the European control, the British control of Jamaica, so they can overcome that.
Yeah, and even sometimes that's not enough, but at least that's something. I mean, I think that's what Vincent Brown starts to show in his book, where he writes about Tacky's Revolt. He starts to show that even the new notion of this affiliation sometimes still there's tension even within that.
One of the things that you mention, and it comes through in the book, is what are the motivations here? I mean, the motivations for the Europeans. It's not just colonization. It's not just, I mean, one of the questions might be even, why would you have to go to Africa and bring people across and there's 9 months and you're making an investment, but you're not going to, why not just enslave the indigenous folks that are already there on the island of Cuba or in Brazil or in the North America?
Yeah.
What is the motivation for slavery, I guess, is in a nutshell.
Right. Well, that labor source here was fickle in a lot of ways. Things like disease, I mean, you don't want to overbeat the horse of the notion of the Spanish sort of dark legend, but Las Casas sort of inferring this idea of, hey, don't enslave the noble savages, the Native Americans, but enslave the Africans instead. Even though he's going to, take that back later. I mean, it kind of speaks to maybe the way people perceived these folks from Africa, right? They're very much were sort of throwaway. I mean, the life expectancy on this side was around 10 years, and that's maybe even in good conditions, And so, I mean, you talk about, folks who had to deal with violence and coercion almost in their entire experience.
Well, yeah, by the time you get here, there's a certain, psychologically you've been suppressed, and physically you've been put down. Right. The other thing I just wonder is Native Americans, they know this territory.
Well, yeah, that's
too. I mean, they know Cuba, they know Brazil.
That's too.
So to say, well, we're going to keep you here, well, tomorrow morning they're gone and you're not going to. Whereas the other hand,
literally,
on the other hand, if you have somebody that's enslaved, that you've separated, that you've crushed, that you've beaten, that you've even corralled, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's the motive is there because there's easier to make the profit without as much, not as much maintenance, so to speak.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny, but I think of it like, why does it take so long for Europe to actually really penetrate Africa? Why does it take so long? Even though the perception is, 19th century sort of march in, but that's the late 19th century. But prior to that, folks weren't walking into the interior of Africa. It's kind of the same thing that you describe. I mean, the natives, they knew their land. There's no way. I mean, they were treacherous. The Europeans didn't go further than the coast. And then for disease, but also because they knew they were very powerful states that could muster tens of thousands of men who would meet you on the battlefield, or ready to meet you on the battlefield, and, in any kind of way. So you could see how that's gonna. But if you grab people up, you snatch them away through violence and other kinds of means. You take them across the water. You bring them over here. They're separated from ancestry. They're separated from identity. They're separated from connections to culture and history. Yeah, you can. They're yours. You can force them. But even in that, and this is why I think what Gates is saying is so unique about this sort of monkey finding the Nganga or finding his spirit at the water, is saying that the understanding of yourself and your experience and coming to terms with this is connected to sort of reaching to this place of the water, because you have folks who will go as spiritualists, literally, who see the migration and the Middle Passage as part of their spiritual development. So they come here and they're like, okay.
So the idea of having forced labor, easier to make a profit, and then you have the ideology, like Kendi says, you create this justification for what you're doing because you're already doing it. Now you need scientific, religious, political, cultural explanations for it. So you create this whole structure of understanding.
Yeah.
So. One of the things you talk about, and I guess it could primarily be European languages, English, French, German, Dutch, that had some of these accounts. But were there also languages from Africa? So the indigenous languages in Africa that you were able to find documents of that appear in this collection?
Not as like
Not
Ibu
or not Yoruba
or in Europe or in an account or written out in that way. No, just the references. A lot of times they're phonetic too. The references to places and spaces, and as we've progressed in our learning of the pronunciation of, for instance, like the tree language and amongst the Akan people, then you kind of see, oh, okay, this is this is how you sort of understand where this place is. Like, because for instance, Elmina Castle most people recorded this as Amina, Amina, and then even affiliated an ethnicity to that, which there really not necessarily wasn't one. There were folks who were Akan, there were Goth, there were other people who were all coming through that space, but people put them to the notion of a nation to put them together.
Well, you have to create a nation.
To say, okay, these are these folks. Or the same thing that happens, with the Komrati. And I like that justification stuff that you're describing there, because it does play a role.
One thing that seems to carry this is the argument that you can hear from some that say, well, it wasn't just whites that were doing the enslaving. There were black nations, and black, people would catch their fellows, and then they would turn them over and they would sell them. So, but one of the things that's mentioned or comes clear in your book is that there's these class hierarchies. There's hierarchies throughout. It wasn't just a hierarchy with the king and queen in England or France, but there's also a different kind of hierarchy, granted. But to what extent does this affect not the slave trade itself, but when people get to this side, what do you bring from your class hierarchy or your cultural values? What comes with you?
Interesting. I mean, I think folks will bring what they know sometimes. I mean, I go back to the example of the Akwamu, who are an Akan people during this 1729-1730 war to create this state. And they get brought over to the Danish West Indies, and people acknowledge the one as a royal, and the priest is acknowledged as a priest. One of the first things they start planning to do is take over the island. They actually do attack Fredericksburg Fort, and their plan is they're going to install this guy as a king.
A new king,
yes, and they're going to dictate terms. They want to create their own sort of triangle system.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it does suggest the value of sort of identity and status and what that may have meant, even in and around the parameters of the slave trade. But obviously, folks will be stripped completely sort of to the bone in terms of status. Sometimes you see it crop up in varying ways. Sometimes different Europeans will have connections to Africans from the African side of the water, and then they'll see them in enslavement. And so there's some interface in that way. But oftentimes, slavery will sort of completely reduce status. Folks who had
wipe it out.
A king or a queen becomes maroon, or maybe house slave, field slave, that kind of thing. Yeah.
We don't have a lot of time, but the one thing I thought we might end on is you have many voices here, 500 voices, which is, way more than most historians have thought, so this is going to be a contribution in itself. But what about the history of slavery that this informs us? What does this have to do with contemporary racism? I mean, what's the connect? I mean, I'm sure historians get asked this all the time. But, okay, you know this about the 18th century, but what the heck does this have to do with, 2023? So.
Yeah. They just point us to the dynamism of this experience. The transatlantic thoroughfare and the experiences of the violent exchange are there, but also, too, we got to remember this as a thoroughfare of culture and ideas and peoples and other things. And if we're going to say that maybe Enlightenment narratives sort of question the humanity of the African subjects, here you have in the African indigenous perspective and voice, it's inherent, it's presumed. The humanity of these folks is presumed. So there's no question of that. And for me, that's sort of most important. It draws you to these powerful narratives, the Hausa states, the Gold Coast, the Yoruba states, the Congo. Yeah. There's just so much there, the Jollof states, that are really engaging, and people who are in and out of state systems, who are mobile folks, So I like that these voices point us to the multifaceted stories. There are many stories. And if there's any takeaway for folks in the sort of contemporary space, stop telling the same narrative that you've been telling and tell a new one, because you have the resources to tell.
Well, many of the things that you've shared with us in this short time indicates that there was resistance, there was revolutionary potential, and that's the other thing that's what inspires me, that's what attracts me to many things, is not just, there's an oppression, there's inequality, but people don't take it. They resist, and they've been successful, and you just mentioned a number of nations that were successful, and ultimately, like South Africa or Nigeria, you get rid of the British or you get rid of the Dutch. So that has to be, and I'm sure we'll see when we get our hands on the book, the voices that express part of this as resistance and dignity and humanity that kind of rises above out of all of the mythology that we have about how slavery is tolerable or understandable or was passively nice. So.
Yep, definitely.
Well, Dr. Hanserd, we never have enough time. Maybe you can come back, write another book, do some more research, and we'll.
Sounds great.
But thank you for being here.
Thank
you. All the time we have on our program. I want to thank Dr. Robert Hanserd for joining me today on the Roundtable. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.